Thank you for joining me on The Things That Bother Me. This is where we take apart systems and look at what actually happened. No nostalgia, no softening, no distractions. If something broke, we trace when it broke. If someone benefited, we name it. That's what we do here. This series is about the baby boomers, and the thesis is blunt. Boomers are the most self-centered generation in modern American history, not because of stereotypes. Because of outcomes. They inherited the strongest economic foundation the United States has ever seen: affordable housing, cheap college, strong unions, sustainable entitlement math, expanding public investment. And during their decades of dominance, that foundation shifted. Housing detached from wages, tuition exploded, debt ballooned, wealth concentrated, risk transferred downward, entitlements were protected without recalibration. Public goods weakened once they were no longer personally needed. The pattern followed life's stage. When they needed it, it expanded. When they aged out of it, it tightened. When it protected their assets, it stayed. When it benefited younger generations, it got cut. Over the next episodes, we're going to break down exactly how that happened step by step. If you're here for comfort, this won't be comfortable. If you're here for clarity, let's begin. Episode 1: The generation that inherited the peak. They were handed the summit. Let's strip the nostalgia out of this. The baby boomers walked into adulthood at the most structurally advantaged moment in modern American history. Not slightly better, not modestly stable. Peak: industrial dominance, expanding infrastructure, affordable housing, public universities that didn't require lifetime debt, strong unions, wages that tracked productivity. A tax base capable of funding long-term commitments. A demographic pyramid with more workers than retirees. They inherited a system that worked, and instead of fortifying it, they optimized it for themselves. This isn't about vibes. It's about trajectory. Over the next 4 decades, as they became the largest voting bloc and filled the halls of power, the pattern repeated. Protect what benefits us now, defer what benefits the future. That's not an accident. That's self-centered governance at scale. The economy they walked into. Post-World War II America wasn't magic. It was policy and positioning. The U.S. was the dominant industrial exporter. Europe and Asia were rebuilding. Manufacturing jobs were plentiful and paid living wages. Home prices were 2 to 3 times annual income in many markets. Public universities were heavily subsidized. Corporate tax rates were high enough to fund public goods. Income inequality was historically low compared to today. You could graduate high school, get a job, buy a house, and raise a family on one income. That wasn't luck. That was structure. Boomers didn't create that structure. They stepped into it fully operational. 2. The shift from maintenance to extraction. As boomers aged into political dominance in the 1980s and 1990s, the philosophy changed. The focus moved from maintaining broad stability to maximizing individual gain. Marginal tax rates were slashed. Corporate taxes fell. Financial deregulation expanded. Union power declined. Shareholder value became doctrine. Asset growth became the national obsession. If you already owned property or stocks, you benefited massively. If you didn't, the door slowly narrowed. This is where the generational split begins. Because boomers were positioned on the inside. 3. Housing: buy low, block entry. Boomers bought homes when prices were tethered to wages. Then, as homeowners, many supported zoning restrictions that limited density, blocked multi-family housing, and slowed development. Supply tightened, prices surged, equity ballooned, scarcity became policy. The same generation that accessed affordable ownership became the generation that protected inflated property values. That's not accidental economics. That's self-preservation. 4. Education: cheap for us, debt for you. Boomers attended public universities when state funding was strong and tuition was manageable. Then public funding declined. Tuition soared. Student loans expanded to fill the gap. The shift was clear. Public investment equals private liability. They climbed the ladder cheaply. Then the ladder got a price tag. 5. The financialization era. The American economy moved from wage-driven to asset-driven. Manufacturing declined. The financial sector expanded. Pensions shifted to 401ks. Risk migrated from employer to employee. Boomers accumulated during one of the longest sustained asset booms in modern history. Younger generations entered later, with higher entry costs, higher debt, and less institutional protection. Boomers rode the expansion wave. Everyone else paddles in choppier water. 6. The cultural shift. I got mine. This isn't just policy, it's culture. The generation branded as the me generation didn't get that label randomly. The dominant tone became personal responsibility over systemic design, low taxes over public investment, asset protection over accessibility, protect retirement at all costs. When structural reform threatened current comfort, resistance surged. When reform would have preserved long-term balance at short-term cost, it stalled. Short-term gain won, again and again. 7. The structural contrast then. Wages tracked productivity, housing matched income, tuition was affordable. Worker-to-retiree ratios were favorable, public goods expanded. Now, wages lag productivity, housing detaches from income, tuition burdens lifetime earnings, fewer workers support more retirees, wealth concentrates at the top. That's not a random economic drift, it's a generational arc. In closing, the summit was not supposed to be a looting point. They were handed a country at structural altitude, not symbolic greatness, not myth, structural advantage. An industrial base unmatched in the world, a middle class expanding in real time, wages that rose with productivity, affordable housing tethered to income, public universities funded as investments, not debt traps. A tax base strong enough to build highways, schools, and research institutions without mortgaging the future. A demographic balance that made entitlement systems sustainable. It wasn't accidental. It was engineered through policy, sacrifice, and long-term thinking by the generations before them. And when the boomers came of age, they didn't inherit collapse. They inherited momentum. The defining question of this era is simple. What do you do when you inherit momentum? You either reinforce it or you consume it. Over the next 4 decades, the pattern became clear. The governing instinct was not preservation of balance, it was maximization of advantage. Taxes lowered without structural offsets. Deregulation expanded while guardrails weakened. Housing supply restricted while property values surged. Public investment reduced once personally utilized. Retirement systems protected without demographic recalibration. Debt accumulated to maintain comfort. Every individual decision could be defended in isolation. Collectively, they shifted the architecture. The post-war model was wage-centered and broad-based. The boomer-era model became asset-centered and protectionist. If you owned, you won. If you entered late, you paid more. That's the pivot. And here's the part that matters most. This wasn't a short window. This was sustained dominance. For decades, they were the largest voting bloc, the dominant workforce cohort, the primary office holders, the cultural tone setters. The direction of the country reflected their priorities. They inherited a system designed to spread opportunity. They exit one that concentrates it. The difference is not subtle. When a generation receives a structure that works and leaves one under strain, history takes note. Not of intentions, not of slogans, of outcomes. The housing market is tighter. Education is more expensive. Debt is heavier. Wealth is more concentrated. The worker-to-retiree ratio is weaker. The funding base is thinner. The obligations are larger. That's the ledger. Boomers didn't inherit fragility. They inherited strength. They didn't enter crisis. They entered expansion. And as this series unfolds, we're going to examine what happens when expansion is treated like a permanent entitlement rather than a responsibility. Because the summit they stood on was never meant to be a looting point. It was meant to be reinforced for those climbing next. Episode 2 is where we stop talking about the peak and start breaking down the ladder. Episode 1 set the baseline. Boomers inherited the peak, economically, structurally, demographically. They walked into expansion, stability, and affordability. And over decades of dominance, the system shifted toward asset protection and short-term advantage. That's the foundation of the argument. Next episode, we get sharper. We're going into the policy timing, the drinking age reversal, abortion access, tuition shifts, zoning lockouts, and the pattern of expanding rules when they needed them and tightening them when they didn't. We're going to map the ladder, because once you see the sequencing, you can't unsee it. This is The Things That Bother Me. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.